Hi, I'm Queer Joe. Thanks for joining me. Today we're going to go through a new crochet hat beanie design that I'm really thrilled about. It's called the Crochet Thermal Stitch Beanie. I'm going to talk a little bit about the benefits of this particular hat and the design. I'm going to talk a little bit about the one shortfall I see with the design, and I'm also going to go through a brief tutorial on how to actually start the hat and create a hat of your own, giving you the information that you need to be able to create your own. So let's get right to it. In terms of the benefits, the fabric that's created with the thermal stitch, the crochet thermal stitch, if you're not familiar with the stitch design, is it creates this very plush, thick, and warm fabric. I don't know if you can tell quite how thick and squishy and plush it is, but it's really quite a nice and very warm fabric. You can actually make this hat also, like many crochet hat designs, you can make it using any weight of yarn, and I'm going to show you how to adapt for different weights of yarn and give you an example of the number of stitches and the number of rounds I did on various weights, including fingering, DK, and worsted weight. And it's also the fabric that it creates is more structured than some of the other crochet fabrics that I've made, which I consider to be a good thing, because the shape of this beanie is such that when I wear it on my head, the structure actually reshapes my head a little bit in such a way that it's more flattering. I tell people often that I have one superpower, and that's I can make any hat look stupid just by putting it on my head. That's not really true, but this particular shaping, since it actually forms the crown of my head and makes it a more rounded shape because it's got a little bit more stiffness and structure to it, actually flatters my head when I wear it. The one last thing that I'll say is I love the fabric that this thing creates. It's very reminiscent of the thermal underwear fabric that I used to wear as a kid when I was going out wearing in the cold to go skating or skiing. It's got kind of that waffled sort of dimpled waffled sort of look, and it's also got the two-sided warmth and plushness to it. And that's the other thing, is the hat is completely reversible. So even when you've got stripes and things like that in the design, you can completely reverse the hat and the fabric looks the same on both sides. It does require that you be careful with how you weave in your ends so that you can wear it in a reversible way. But both sides of the hat look the exact same, both in terms of the color and the fabric texture that you have. There's one downside to what I think is a downside to this particular design, and that is while it's knit in the round, or crochet in the round, sorry, it actually does create a subtle but visible seam in the place where you actually turn around and crochet back the other way. So that is one thing that you have to recognize is going to be there. It shows up a little bit more visibly when you have striping sometimes, just like with other things where you have striping, there might be a jog, but that is one downside. The other just idiosyncrasy of this particular fabric is that I highly recommend using a hook size when I'm making this fabric that's larger than you would normally use for the weight of yarn that you're going to use. So for instance, if you would normally use a G-hook for a worsted weight yarn, or a 5mm hook for worsted weight yarn, I recommend going up to, in my case, I used a K-hook, which I think is a 6.5mm hook. And it fills in completely well, and also helps make it a little bit easier, so you don't need quite as many stitches and rounds to be able to create the same hat. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to tutorial mode, and we're going to show you actually how to start making this hat. Some of the other tutorials you see have create this hat from the bottom up to the crown, so they start with a lot of stitches and then decrease down to get to the shaping at the top of the crown of the hat. I don't find that to be as useful. It's a little bit easier, especially if you want to size this hat to your head or somebody's head that you know the circumference of. It's a little bit easier to start at the top, and especially if you've never done this thermal stitch before, crochet thermal stitch before, because it can be a little bit difficult to start when you're starting with 80 or 100 stitches at the bottom. So let's go ahead and get to the tutorial. So if you'd like to join in and knit along as I demonstrate how to knit this hat, you can choose any weight of yarn that you'd like with a corresponding crochet hook. So this particular beanie was knit with worsted weight yarn and a size K or 6.5 millimeter hook. So if you like the texture of that one, feel free to pull out some. You need approximately 150, 160 yards of yarn to be able to make the hat, and you can make it in obviously multiple colors. I did a contrasting color for this one. This one was done in fingering weight yarn, however it was done on a size H hook or a 5 millimeter hook. This is probably my favorite fabric that I've created, and that combination of a much larger hook than fingering weight should normally take in crochet. And again, you can, even if you have multiple colors, it takes about 160, 170 yards of fingering weight. This one was also done in fingering weight yarns, two different fingering weight yarns, but it was done on a F hook, a 3.7 millimeter hook, and I really love this fabric as well. It's a little bit denser than the one done on the H hook, the 5 millimeter hook, but the particular yarn I used was very soft and has kind of like an aura to it that I like. Finally, this is the one we're going to actually demonstrate. This is a DK weight yarn, and associated with that I used also an H hook. So it's only slightly above what you would normally use for a DK weight yarn or a 5 millimeter hook. So let's go ahead and take a look at that and see how we start this hat. So I have my DK weight yarn and a size H hook or a 5 millimeter hook. Slightly larger than the hook you would normally use for a DK weight yarn. You can use any weight yarn you want. I'm not going to tell you the exact number of stitches you should use in the circumference of your hat, or the exact number of rounds that you should do to get the length of hat you want, but I will tell you how to get the specific measurements for the hat that you want based on the number of stitches and rounds that you do. So for those of you who know the magic ring, you can fast forward through this part, but basically I take the tail end of my yarn and lay it across the inside of my 4 fingers. I wrap it around the top 2 fingers and cross over that first strand so that I have this kind of crossover piece. And then I take the ball end of the yarn and put it between my ring finger and pinky. Turn this over, put my hook under the first strand, pull under the second strand and twist it. And then when I take it off my fingers, you see that I have the loop, which is just a kind of a simple untightened knot, but 2 strands, including the tail end and the actual ring that you've created, that we're going to do 8 double crochets over. So I'm going to, over those 2 strands, I'm going to create 8 double crochets. Okay? So standard 8, it's nothing different for the thermal stitch. You start with the same single crochets as you would for almost every circular type of crochet project that you've ever done. That's 1. 6, 7, and that's about to be 8, 8, 8. And so now I have my 8 single crochets along that that were crocheted over these 2 strands of yarn, the ring and the tail end of the yarn. Taking a grip of the tail end of the yarn and kind of pinching lightly on the last single crochet that I did, I just snug up, and you'll see it pulls that through and brings your first single crochet right up to the beginning and creates that little tight, what's now known as magic ring. Once you've gotten that relatively tightened up, and you can tighten it up a little further later, you connect the first single crochet with the second by going underneath the 2 legs of the first single crochet stitch and doing a slip stitch. So slip stitch it through. And so now I have my 8 single crochets tightened into a tight ring. The first round you're going to do is also pretty standard crochet for a lot of different projects. Single crochet or chain 1, and in that first stitch into both legs of the stitch, you're going to execute 2 single crochets in each stitch. So I just put 2 in the first single crochet, going into the second, both legs of the second. Sorry, it's a little fiddly when it's this small for my fat fingers. Oh, that's why, because I didn't go into. That's 1 single crochet in that stitch, and 2 single crochets. So that's 4 total single crochets on this round so far. And the third stitch, 2 more for 6. And the fifth one, or the fourth one rather, 2 more for 8. And the fifth one, 2 more for 10. The sixth one, 2 more for 12. Seventh one, 2 more for 14. And finally, in the last single crochet, 2 more for 16 total single crochets in the second round. Make sense? So here we've got that. Now you'll notice that the magic ring maybe isn't that magic. It kind of comes unloosened a little bit. You can either tighten that up now, which I will do a little bit now, but even if that comes undone before you weave in this end, I'm going to show you something to do with that woven in end, so you might want to make sure that you have at least 5 or 6 good inches on that starting end. And if you don't, you might want to go back and restart that process, especially if you want more practice in the magic ring. So now we're going to start the thermal stitch in the round. To do the thermal stitch in the round, it's pretty much the same instructions for every round. This is the first single crochet in the last round. I'm inserting underneath both those legs of that stitch and doing a slip stitch back through into the current loop to connect that ring so it's connected. I do 1 chain and then turn my work and then only in the back of the first round of thermal stitches, this is kind of a setup round, but I do a single crochet in each one of just the back loop. See, just the back loop of that previous round. Six, 7, 8. Now that I'm halfway through, I just want to show you something. So as I've done the 8 stitches so far, about half the round, you can see the standard chain that appears on the outside edge of my stitch. But the other thing you notice is this little ridge of the front loop of the stitch in the round below. And that loop we're going to use in every round of thermal stitch that we do from now on. So we've got 8, back a stitch only, 9, single crochet, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 single crochets. Now here are the instructions for the thermal stitch from every time going forward. This is how you will execute the thermal stitch. You will do a slip stitch into the first single crochet underneath both legs of that first single crochet. So you insert your needle under the 2 stitches of that first single crochet of that last round, loop over and pull through both those 2 loops and your current loop as a standard slip knot. You'll chain 1 and then you'll turn your work. We don't continue to go in the round, we turn and go back the way we came. And then the thermal stitch is a standard single crochet into the back of this loop, the back of the loop that you just created, and the front of the loop in the round below. So you see that? So we've got our current loop. This is the back of the loop that we're crocheting into, and the front of the loop in the round below, that ridge that was created when we only went to the back of the loop in that last round. Make sense? So you pull that through those 2 loops and finish executing your single crochet. That is the thermal stitch. So it's insert into the back of the loop and into the front of the loop in the round below. Pull that through, execute the second single crochet thermal. Back of the loop, front of the loop in the round below, pull it through, 3 single crochets thermal. So I typically like to hold my work as if I'm holding like a very thick coin so that I can see the back of the loop of my last round and the front of the loop of the round below, and they kind of line up. You can see you get very adept at inserting your crochet hook into those 2 loops after a while. And the other thing is, I have to make a confession. I'm not a very experienced crocheter, And so you might have noticed that from my vocabulary about crochet. But I'm not a very adept crocheter, and I do have to keep track of all my stitches currently, or else I'm afraid I'm going to accidentally increase or decrease. So I'm just going to show, for those of you who also worry about that kind of stuff, I want to show you how I count my stitches, because it's kind of important to be able to know how many single crochets, in this case, in the thermal stitch that I've created. So I see by this little bump, this little slip stitch bump, that's the beginning of the round that I just started when I turned around and started my work back. This is the first stitch, this first V, the second chain is here, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is the last one before the loop on my hook, and so I've done 7 single crochets so far. And from now on I need to count. But I oftentimes lose track when I'm watching television or creating a tutorial video, for instance. 8. 9. 10. 11. 14, 15, 16. Okay, so now what we've got is, and I can kind of point to this a little bit pretty clearly, I think. We've got the magic ring. We have which had 8 single crochets in it. Then we doubled those to get the first round of double crochet, or single crochet rather, and got 16, and then we had 16. Then we did to the back of the loop, 16 around to the back of the loop, and then we did 16 complete thermal stitch single crochets. So we currently have 16 thermal stitch crochet stitches on the needle, on the hook, and now we're going to do an increase round. But I want to talk a little bit about how you determine when you do an increase round. Typically how I decide on when an increase round needs to happen is when the disc starts looking more like a shallow bowl or a yarmulke than it does a flat disc. So in this particular case, you can kind of notice that it's small, so it's harder to see perhaps, but the disc is starting to become more of a concave dish shaped. And so that means to me, that's the indicator that I need to do an increase round. And so since I started with 8 stitches on my magic ring, all my increase rounds I do in 8 increases. I do 8 increases in those. And so the increase round is pretty similar to a standard thermal stitch, but it's slightly different in a couple ways. I start it the same way. I insert my hook into underneath the 2 legs of the first stitch on that last round and pull it through in a slip stitch. I chain 1 and then turn my work. And in this first stitch, I do a single crochet into the back of the first stitch and the loop of the front of the stitch in the round below, pull that through and execute 1 single crochet, and then I put another one into that same 2 loops. So I do 2 single crochets in that. But since I have 16 stitches on my round currently, and I only want to increase 8, I'm only going to do that every other stitch. So in this case, I'll just do 1-for-1 single crochet into the back of the loop and to the front of the loop in the round below. Then 2 into the next one, and 1 into the next one. So now I've converted 4 stitches into 6 by adding 2 different stitches every other stitch. Make sense? 7, 8, and 9. Ten, 11, 2 in that one, and 1 in this one for 12. 13 and 14 into the next stitch. 15 into the next. 16 and 17 into the next. And the 18th into the next. 19th and 20th into the next single crochet, doing it in the thermal stitch fashion. 19, 20, and 21 into the next, 21st into the next stitch. And 22 and 23, 22nd, 23rd into the next stitch. And then finally the 24th into the last double or single crochet in the last round. Two things that you may notice. One is that it starts to flatten out. So the more stitches you have, the easier it can lay out flat and it doesn't look concave. And so as long as it stays relatively flat looking, I continue to do no increase thermal stitch rounds by doing a slip stitch into the first stitch from the round before, chain 1, turn my work, and then insert my hook under the back of the first single crochet going back and the front of the stitch on the round below, which kind of matches up. And I do the same for the second stitch. But since the round below, not the last round, but the round below that, doesn't have an increase yet, I have to put my third stitch, my third single crochet, into the back of my next single crochet and the prior loop. See, it goes. Normally I would, if the last one wasn't an increase, I'd try to do it underneath the corresponding loop in the round below the last round of single crochets. But since we didn't do increases, I have to do a 1 for 2 match with that second loop, not the first one, but the second loop. Pull that through and finish executing. So let me show you that one more time in terms of how you finish the increase. So in my next single crochet, I insert into the back of the loop and into the loop into the round, the front of the loop into the round below. It's a 1 for 1 match, everything is good. But these next two stitches, these next two single crochets, this one and this one, only have one loop in the round below that to be worked into. So it's a 2 for 1. So I insert into the back of my last one and to the front of the one below, execute my single crochet, and then insert my hook into the back of the next single crochet, but the prior front of the loop on the round below, and pull that through and do the double crochet. And so in essence, I'm finishing the increase on the second round. Every increase round really requires 2 rounds to resolve the total number of stitches into the total number of loops in the prior 2 rounds, if that makes sense. So again, I'm going to just do a standard thermal single crochet in that one, the first one, and the next 2, they'll both go into that loop right there. So this one goes into that loop, and this one goes into the loop on the round below. Now again, I have to count just to make sure I'm not increasing or decreasing stitches. So that's the little slip bump. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I've done 9 so far, and we had increased to 24, right? The last time. 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So every multiple of 3, 15 in this case, has to go into the prior round's loop before. 16, 17, oops, has to go into the prior loop because it's a multiple of 3, 18, 19, 20, and 21 goes into the prior loop because it's got a 1 to 2 match, or 2 to 1 match rather. 22, 23, and 24. And now, since we're going to be coming back this way, we have a 1-for-1 match of the back of the loop on the most recent round and the front of the loop on the round previous to that. There'll be a 1-for-1 match. So since the disc looks relatively flat, I do an assessment usually every other row or every row or so to assess whether or not I should do an increase round. And as soon as it gets to the point where it looks really concave, now I'm kind of forcing it into that shape, but when I lay it down flat, it looks pretty flat, and so it doesn't require any kind of shaping. But as soon as it does, it's my indicator to do shaping for that. And that changes based on what weight of yarn you're using and what size hook you're using and the tension and gauge that you're getting. So I'm going to do my slip stitch into the first stitch of the last round, chain 1, turn my work, and do a complete no increase round. Again, into the back of the last loop of the last round and the front of the round below that, all the way around. Six, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12. And on the next one, I'm going to do another increased round just so I can show you on a slightly bigger piece of fabric, because you'll be able to see that the 2 rounds that make up for an increased round, one is where you do 2 single crochets into the same 2 loops, and on the round following that you do a single crochet into the back of the next loop and the you have to double up on the loop below that and the previous round. And hopefully it'll be a little clearer on a slightly larger piece of fabric that we've created at this point. If you've already gotten it, you understand that, just continue doing increase and non-increase rounds, and do an increase anytime it looks concave, like it's starting to look like now, and don't do increase rounds when it looks relatively flat. And that's how I determine it until I get to the total number of stitches I want. In my case, I'm going to go for 72, but in your case, you're going to wait until the measurement from this edge to this edge is approximately 6.5 or 7 inches wide. So for my hat, I have a circumference of about 23 inches, a 23-inch circumference head, and a 7-inch diameter would create, if you calculate that out, it's about a 22-inch circumference hat. So with a 22-inch hat circumference and a 23-inch head, I have just the right amount of negative ease to hold this in. This particular fabric doesn't stretch out as much as some crochet stitches might. The thermal stitch is a little bit more or less elastic, and so as a result, you want to have it be as close to fitting as possible with a little bit of negative ease. And 1 inch of negative ease on a 23-inch circumference head is just about what I like. And I'll kind of show you the, when I finish up the hat, I'll show you kind of what it looks like when I put it on. So that's my 24th. This is going to be an increase round. So I'm going to do the slip stitch, chain 1, turn my work, single crochet into the first stitch, and do a second single crochet into the same 2 loops so I can do an increase. Then since I only want to increase 8 and I have 24, I'm only going to do that on the first of 3 stitches. So I'll do 2 in the first one, 1 in the second, and 1 in the third. Two in the fourth, one in the fifth, and 1 in the sixth. No, that's not right. Sorry, I miscounted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that's 1 in the 7th and 8th, not and the. So I basically did 2 in the first stitch, 3rd and 4th in single stitches, 5th and 6th in the same stitch, 7th and 8th in their own individual stitches. Then 9th and 10th into the next stitch, 11th and 12th in their own individual thermal stitch loops. And 13 and 14 in the same 2 loops. And 14 and 15, or no, I'm sorry, 13 and 14 in their own, in one loop, and then 15 and 16 in their own loops, 17 and 18 in one in the same 2 loops, 19 and 20. Oops. 19 and 20 in their own. (21) and 22 in the same 2 loops. 23 and 24 and individual single crochets. 25 and 26 27, 28, and 2 in the next, 29 and 30th, singles for 31 and 32. So we went from 24 and increasing every third stitch to add 8 more, so we're up to 32 stitches now. And now I'm going to go back on the second round for this increase round just to show you on hopefully a slightly easier to see. I do a slip stitch in the first stitch, chain 1, turn my work. The first 2 stitches are standard into the back of the stitch on the prior row and the front of the stitch on 2 prior rounds. Pull that through, execute the stitch, and do the same for the second stitch. But third and fourth stitch have to share the same bottom loop. So this, let me give it a little pointer. The back of this stitch and the back of this stitch will both be worked through the front of this stitch, since there's only one in that round to go for 2 stitches on this round, right? So again, I do 1 single crochet into the back of this loop and the front of that loop, and then 1 into the back of this loop and the front of that loop, and doubling up on that front loop in the round previous. These are standard, the next 2 are standard thermal stitch single crochets. But the next one we're going to double up the lower stitch. So this stitch and this stitch will both go into this stitch. And that's how you do increase the second round of increases. If you have any questions, feel free to put those questions in comments, and I'd be more than happy to try to answer those. And basically what I'm going to be doing, and I'm not going to make you wade through this, is I'm going to continue doing increase rounds every time my disc starts to look more like a yarmulke or a shallow bowl. And I'm going to do non-increase rounds every time when it's laying relatively flat, and continue to do that until from edge to edge, when I take a measurement from edge to edge, right now we're at like about 3 inches, but I want my edge to edge to be somewhere between 6.5 and 7 inches. And that's when I know that I can stop doing any shaping on the crown of the head, and I can just do the tube of 72. In my case, that's going to be at 72 stitches because I've already made hats like this with this gauge of yarn and needle. And so I know when I hit 72 stitches, also I'm going to stop doing any shaping and just start doing the standard tube. And in my case, I'm also going to do a total of 46 rounds of thermal stitch knitting to get to the base of it, because I happen to know that's the length I like. It covers my ears and creates a nicely fitting and nice shaped hat. And so I'll come back to you as soon as I've gotten up to the 7 inch or 6.5 to 7 inch wide diameter on my disc, and show you what we go from there. There's 2 other things I want to show you when we get there. So we'll talk to you then. I've just finished the second round of the increase round of the thermal stitch that brought the diameter of the hat, and this is from edge to edge, not flattened out. So if I were to flatten this out, it would be a little bit wider in diameter. But you can see that It's about 6.5, a little over 6.5 inches wide, which is about correct. As I start to not do any more increases and just create the tube of fabric coming off the down from the crown of the hat, it will actually expand out to a little over 7 inches, maybe about 7 inches in terms of diameter. And my head is approximately 23 inches in circumference when I measure it, and a 7-inch diameter. I'm sorry, so my head is a 23-inch circumference, if that's not what I just said. And a 7-inch diameter ends up being about a 22-inch circumference of a hat. So it has a little bit of negative ease. And this particular fabric doesn't have a whole lot of stretch to it. And so you want to make sure it fits pretty closely. Mine has about an inch of negative ease as it turns out. So I'm creating about a 22-inch circumference hat for approximately 23-inch circumference head. So a couple other things I wanted to show you. Now that I've finished through all the increases associated with the hat, one of the things that I had pointed out earlier on is in the first round you see that it actually has this ridge that looks slightly different than the remaining part of the thermal stitch. One of the ways that I found to get rid of that is to take you'll notice it's also not on the inside of the hat, what I call the inside of the hat. There is a slight ridge there that's slightly different, but it looks very similar to the rest of the thermal stitch rounds, but the other side doesn't. So what I do is I basically take a darning needle, as if I'm going to weave in this end. I push it through to the other side. And so I want to flatten this out a little bit so you can see kind of what I'm doing. I basically want to bring my needle into the two stitches that are across from each other, across from that little moat from each other. And all I'm doing is, sorry, my yarn caught up in there. All I'm doing is tightening up that little moat by going back and forth between the corresponding stitches on the inside round versus the one directly outside the expanded ridge. And I do that with, oops. So you may want to make sure that you've left enough of a tail when you first create your magic ring and your 8 single crochets. Some people don't care about this particular extra ridge. I just figure I'm going to make the hat perfectly reversible and try to eliminate any differences between the stitches. So I'm just bringing the yarn and the needle back and forth across that small little gap that's created by the standard double crochets as opposed to the single crochets as opposed to the thermal single crochets. For all intents and purposes, that little gap between those two rounds completely disappears. In fact, I find this to be a better looking side than the other side when it comes to the ridges created by that standard round of single crochets. And then I can just take this yarn and weave it in as invisibly as possible and secure it off. So now I've got my 7-inch diameter circle, or 6.5 in this case, diameter circle, and I'm just going to continue on doing rounds of thermal stitch single crochet, chain 1, turn my work, knit into the back of the loop of the stitch before, and the front of the stitch on the previous round. Now I screwed that up. So now that I've got my 7-inch diameter or 6.5-inch diameter crown of my hat, I'm going to finish it by doing approximately 50 rounds of, and this was going to vary based on, actually this hat I ended up doing 46 rounds of no increase thermal stitch crochet. So I do my standard slip stitch to connect the round, chain 1, turn my work, and then with no increases, crochet into the back of the last stitch, the last single crochet I did, and the front of the single crochet in the round below, and execute the single crochet and continue on. Now I know I have 72 stitches in my round, and that will remain constant for all 46 rounds that I do. The other thing I wanted to show you, and I'm going to go back to the start of this round to show you that, is how to change colors. It's a very simple process. It doesn't require any kind of skills. So once we've gotten to the end of a round and you want to change colors, normally you would start the next round by doing your slip stitch. Instead, just switch to a new color yarn, and again leave about 3 or 4 inches so that you can weave in that end, and execute the slip stitch with the new color. So I wrap the new color around and pull that through as just a standard slip stitch, chain 1, turn my work, and in that first old color stitch, the back of that stitch, I pull it through the back and the front of the stitch on the one below, and execute my single crochet. Now you see that old color has a little bit of a extra slack in it, so you can just cinch that up once you've going to finish off, but you just standardly go around that round of 70, in my case 72 stitches, with no increases, executing the thermal stitch in the back of the stitch on the last round and the front of the stitch on the round previous to that. Execute the single crochet, and so on. What you're noticing is that since this is going into the 2 last rounds, that you're putting it into 2 loops of color, of the old color. On the next round of this color green, it might look black to you, but it's actually a very dark green. On the second round of green in this stripe, and I recommend that you do at least 2 rounds of any color stripe. Otherwise it's a little bit too thin because it's kind of like you're only making a half a stitch per, or half a row per round of standard crochet. But on the second round of this color, you're going to find that you'll be putting it into the back loop of a green stitch and the front loop of the white or the lighter stitch in the row below that. So that's how you change colors. So once all is said and done, in essence, this is about the ending of where I finished shaping to 32. I ended up doing 36 rounds, which includes four, in this particular case, 4 rounds of the green color in this stripe, and then I did 2 rounds at the edge to give me the contrasting color. And for those of you who want to do hats in different size yarns or hooks, here are 4 different hats and the different yarns and number of stitches that I used in each one to get my size hat, which I said in the body of the video was a 23-inch circumference head, and it covers my ears. So the first one is fingering weight using a size F or 3.75 millimeter hook. There's 108 stitches in the rounds in the body of the hat and 54 rounds to get the length that I wanted in that. The second one is also done in fingering weight yarn, the one in the gold and the teal stripes. However, I'm using a size H hook or a 5 millimeter hook for that. The number of stitches in the round is 80, and there's a total of 50 rounds to get the length that I like in this particular hat. The third one is the hat that I just demonstrated in the tutorial. It's a DK weight yarn using a size H hook or 5 millimeter. I had to, as you noticed in the tutorial, I had to do 72 stitches to get the diameter of the crown that I wanted, and I had to do 46 rounds after the crown shaping to get the length that I wanted. And finally, the most bulky one that I have is the worsted weight. Worsted weight is done with a size K hook, rather a thick hook, and there were 64 stitches in the unshaped rounds, and I had to do a total of 40 rounds to get the length of the hat that I wanted for that particular one. And here are just a couple pictures of some of the finished hats and how they look on my head. If you have any questions about the pattern or any questions about some of the things that I've shown in the video, please feel free to leave a comment and reach out to me in any way that you know how, and I'm more than happy to get back to you with any answers associated with all of it. And thanks for watching.